I'd like to introduce our presenters. Dr. Peter Addy is a psychotherapist. He earned a PhD in clinical psychology from the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto, California, now called Sophia University. He was at Yale University for 6 years postdoc, doing research and clinical work. While there, he co-founded the Yale Psychedelic Science Group and Speaker Series to help normalize psychedelic research as research. He also joined the Pharmacology lab for his postdoc research on salvia, for which he is very well known. Peter is now in private practice in Washington and Oregon. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. This is a topic that's very exciting for me because I don't know very much about 2C-B. I've certainly heard about it over the years, but I am by no means an expert on any of the Shulgin compounds or any of these phenethylamines. So I've been really enjoying increasing my own awareness and understanding in preparation for today's talk.
Thanks, Peter.
So going to talk a little bit about some history and research. That's going to be mostly my focus, the first two. But first, I want to mention some risks. I'm going to actually start with some of the downers. I'm just going to give you all the bad stuff at the front, and then we can hear some of the more, interesting transpersonal healing stuff later. So I would like to point out to everyone that 2C-B is illegal. Yes, even in Oregon, drugs are still illegal in Oregon, and 2C-B is outlawed. It is a Schedule I substance. As a psychedelic harm reduction and integration therapist, I talk to people about harm all the time, how to reduce harm, how to be aware of harm and manage it. And the number one harm to taking 2C-B is that it's against the law. I combed through the Oregon revised statutes to try to figure out specifically what the penalties and classifications are, but reading statutes is a foreign language to me. I'm not going to pretend that I'm any kind of lawyer or law expert, but this is my best guess. I think that so 2C-B is a Schedule I substance, and it's listed in the Oregon statutes as such. When it gets to penalties, I couldn't find any references to 2C-B specifically. The statutes mention, like, if you have such and such grams of cocaine or methamphetamine or psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, things like that, but they don't mention 2C-B. So I'm borrowing from MDMA. These on the slide here, these are the penalties for possession of MDMA in Oregon, and 2C-B that's the closest one I could find. So if you knowingly or intentionally possess less than a gram of 2C-B, that's a Class E violation. You get a $100 fine, or you can complete a health assessment. If you're in possession of between 1 gram and 5 grams, then that's a Class A misdemeanor. You can be imprisoned for up to less than a year, which is a weird way to word that phrase, but that's how it is. So the maximum penalty is less than a year, which I think means 364 days, a fine of over $6,000 or both. And if you're caught with more than 5 grams of 2C-B, then that's a Class A felony, and you can have up to 20 years imprisonment, $375,000 fine, or both. So when I talk to people, clients that I'm seeing, or just anyone in the general public, if you want to know what are the risks to using 2C-B, the number one risk is that you can be imprisoned for a very long time. The other main harm about 2C-B is also because it's illegal, and that is the fact that you don't really know what you're getting. Any substance that you buy at CVS, if you want to get some Tylenol, there's a known potency and purity. You know exactly what you're getting, how much is in there, and you know that there aren't other things in there. If you go buy some recreational cannabis in Oregon, they test these products to make sure that there aren't any molds or heavy metals or things like that. If you buy 2C-B from a guy who knows a guy, you have no guarantees of either purity or potency. You don't know if your tablet has 5 milligrams or 50 milligrams, and that can be very dangerous. The primary way to reduce harms, if you don't want to be arrested or be imprisoned or fined many hundreds of thousands of dollars, the primary way to reduce that harm is to not possess these things. If the primary harm that you're concerned about is unknown potency and purity, the primary way to reduce that harm is to use a testing kit. You can buy a reagent kit, sometimes called a colorimetric kit, such as the one pictured here. And these kits will tell you if the drug you are looking for is present or not. It won't tell you how much, but it will say if I buy some powder or a pill and the dealers or the plug or whatever kids these days are saying, the plug says that this is 2C-B, you can use a reagent kit and you can say, yep, there's some 2C-B in there. Or the kit will say, no, there is no 2C-B in there. It's something else entirely. Sometimes 2C-B pills are mixed with MDMA or ketamine or cocaine, or it could just be caffeine or sugar. Really nothing interesting or fun at all. So you can use a testing kit like this to weed out counterfeit pills and powders, but they will not tell you if your drug is pure, and they will not tell you the potency of the drug. In order to find that out, you need very expensive testing equipment at a lab and some serious scientific know-how. But a reagent kit like this, pretty easy for anyone to use, doesn't cost a lot of money, and you can buy them from DanceSafe, or you can buy them from my website. I don't sell them myself. I have an affiliate link to DanceSafe, and then I get a little commission. And if I get any commission from any of you, I will be putting that money right into my student loans. So if you want to help me out, you can buy a test kit from the link on my website, but you don't have to. You can just go to dancesafe.org, get the kit from there directly. So the main risks to using 2C-B are that it's illegal. And these laws are, of course, not designed to keep people safe. They're not designed with any sort of rational scientific basis. They were designed specifically to suppress political dissidents and unwanted ethnic and political groups throughout our country's history. And the primary harms that these laws produce are in things like buying drugs with unknown potency or purity, which can lead to overdose, or just bad trips, sometimes death, depending on what might be in it. With those two harms out of the way, let's talk about what 2C-B actually is. The full chemical name is 4-bromo-2,5-dimethoxyphenethylamine. So when I started researching this, my very first question was, why is it called 2C-B? I can see a 2 in there, and I can see a B for bromo. There's no C anywhere in that very long chemical name. So why is this called 2C-B? That was my first question that I needed to answer. So I found out that in 1970, Nixon passed the Controlled Substances Act, which outlawed most things, including mescaline and MDA. And along comes Dr. Alexander Shulgin, who many of you may have heard of. Shulgin wanted to find some legal alternatives. He had been promoting MDA for psychotherapy and MMDA and MDEA, various other combinations of those letters as agents to help with psychotherapy. Those were now illegal, so he wanted to find some novel substances. And I am not an organic chemist. If anyone in the chat, if you have questions about chemical structures and bromide rings and things like that, I am not your man. I got a D in chemistry 101 in college, and I quickly went for a different path. But I do think that most of these things that we're talking about, mescaline, MDMA, MDA, these have 3 carbons on the ring. But Shulgin thought, well, what if we play with some of these 2-carbon compounds, 2-carbon homologs to these illegal chemicals? So mescaline, MDA, they have 3 carbons. Let's just use some 2-carbon chains instead. And then you can, you've got this ring and you can stick various different things to it. So you can stick a bromine on there, 2C-B. You could stick a chlorine on there, 2C-C. You have 2C-I for iodine, 2C, what else? Various other chemical names. So the 2C is that there's a 2-carbon chain, and the B is for bromine. And so Shulgin, if you read his book PIHKAL, or you just kind of go through the literature, you see there's 2C-B, 2C-C, let's see, E, I, T, etc. There's a whole long, complicated list of these names. And so that's what it is. I didn't know this until about a month ago. 2C, because there's 2 carbons on the chain, and then the B is the thing that he substituted out to see what it would do. And so this one is the bromine variant, and he found it to be quite interesting and useful. So it was invented in 1974, and it was never really all that popular. It's not really that popular today. It wasn't popular in the 70s. I think that a big reason for that is because at that same time, he synthesized MDMA. I believe that was the next year in 75, and that became much more famous. Shulgin did not invent MDMA, but he rediscovered it. And as far as I know, he was the first person to ever use it as a human being. But he didn't invent the molecule itself. But he certainly popularized it, which is why he's sometimes referred to as the godfather of MDMA. So he invented 2C-B, and then shortly after he found MDMA, and that became much more popular both for therapy and underground use. I found the original publication from 1975. I was very excited to find this thing. It is, it looks like it was typed up on a typewriter. It's by Shulgin and Carter, 1975. You can find it on Google Scholar. He wrote that he tested it on himself and I think 10 other people, maybe it was 20 other people. He found that you first have psychoactive effects at 4 milligrams of taking pure 2C-B powder. But he wrote that an effective dose is around 10 milligrams. And the effects, the psychoactive, the trip or the experience that you have lasts about 6 to 8 hours. I really like the description that he gave in this 1975 paper because it is the first time human beings ever used 2C-B. There's no expectation effects. There's no placebo effects. There's no, oh, well, I know what happened to my friend, so that's probably what's going to happen to me. They weren't reading about this stuff on Arrowwood. They had no expectations whatsoever. And so this report is really the pure thing. He wrote that when people took 8 to 10 milligrams of 2C-B, they experienced kind of relaxation and passivity and an integration of sensory perception with their emotional state, which is an interesting phrase. It was not hallucinogenic. He contrasts this to LSD and mescaline, that 2C-B is not a hallucinogen. You don't visualize things in the same way, but it does enhance your perceptions. It enhances your bodily awareness, and it does create what he wrote as considerable euphoria, which is a nice phrase to see in an otherwise dry scientific paper. So here we have the very first use of 2C-B in human beings in history, 1975. the next time that human beings used 2CB, or I should say, I mean, probably it's been going on continuously nonstop since 1974 when it was first invented. But as far as peer-reviewed scientific publications go, we've got 1975 and then nothing for 40 years until 2015. This is the second time that a scientific article is written about human beings using 2CB. There's been a ton of stuff with in vitro and rodent models. I even found a paper where they gave 2CB to chickens. I don't understand why. I've never seen that before. But if you're curious, a lot of people in Portland have chickens in their backyard. If you want to know what would happen if you give 2CB to chickens, someone else has the answer for you. That's available on PubMed or Google Scholar. But as far as humans go, as a psychotherapist, my main interest is humans, not rodents, not chickens, not other primates. So we had one in 1975, absolute silence for 40 years. And then here in 2015, we had Gonzalez et al. From Spain, Barcelona, I think, somewhere in Spain. They conducted an observational study where 20 people, 12 women, took 2CB on their own. They had to have used 2CB in the past in order to be included in the study, so they were not naive. And they used it themselves, which is different than the researchers synthesizing or buying 2CB and then administering it to the subjects. In this study, the subjects used it themselves, and the researchers just kind of watched and gave them some assessments. They used a pretty high dose, 20 milligrams. That seems to be what the standard dose is nowadays. If y'all remember, Shulgin back in 75, he said 10 milligrams is the effective dose, but most of the research that I've seen since the 2000s is saying that 20 milligrams is kind of the standard if you're buying a pill on the street, or in this case, when they were purposefully giving, controlling how much 2CB people were using. It seems like 20 milligrams is the ideal goal these days. And they found, so people used 2CB, and then they gave a bunch of tests. They were looking specifically at emotional regulation and empathy. And they found 4 things. They found that when you take 2CB, you are likely to experience negative stimuli as more negative. What that means is that so I'm the researcher, you're the participant. I show you pictures, and these pictures were either positive, negative, or neutral. I don't know exactly what that means, positive, negative, or neutral, but I'm kind of guessing here. But let's say I show you a picture of a baby crying, and then I say to you, how do you feel about this? On a scale of 1 to 10. 10, happy, I love it, and a 1, sad, this is terrible. So I show you a picture of a baby crying, and you say, sober, you say, I don't like that. That's not a nice picture. 4. I rate that a 4. It's not a very happy feeling. And then you take 2CB, and then I show you a similar picture of a baby crying, and I say, how do you feel about this? And you say, oh, that's a 1. That's terrible. This is the worst thing that I've ever seen. Is that child okay? Is there anything I can do about it? This is terrible. So you rate the stimuli as negative when you're sober, and then under the influence of 2CB, you rate it as more negative. But interestingly, that 2CB didn't have any effects on neutral or positive images. So a child smiling, you didn't say, oh, that's more happy, that's more positive, no effects there, but the negative stimuli became more negative. Okay. Second experiment, or second test in the experiment, they showed people, again, they showed the subjects pictures of people in social settings who were displaying emotions. And overall, people under the influence of 2CB were less able to recognize happiness in others. And then they looked at gender differences, and specifically only men were less able to correctly identify anger in other people. But women, there was no difference compared to baseline to sobriety. So overall, people, all people, aren't able, or were not in this case, able to detect happiness based on just nonverbal cues. And men specifically were less able to identify anger. Interesting. Third test, this was a free speech scenario. They just said, hey, talk about your friends for 5 minutes, or talk about your family for 5 minutes. And they recorded it, and then blinded raters kind of rated this 5-minute period of free speech. And they found out that people on 2CB expressed more emotionality. When you were sober, you would talk about friends and family, but you didn't really, it was just kind of monotone or just sort of there, not a big deal. But under the influence of 2CB, you were very emotional in your expressions, in the content and quality of your speech. However, in this free speech exercise, 2 women spontaneously burst into tears, and they marked that as, the most emotional. But then 1 man had what they referred to as an attack of spontaneous laughter. And that man was excluded from that part of the research. So if women express emotion as crying, they marked that as emotion. But if a man expressed emotion as spontaneous laughter, they said, oh, that doesn't count. We're just not going to include that in our study. So that sounds like sexist bullshit to me, but I wasn't there. I don't know how this works. So take number 3 with a grain of salt, but perhaps women or all people are more emotional when under the influence of 2CB. And then finally, people did not experience anger very much compared to baseline. There was a decreased self-report of feelings of anger. Okay, so this is how 2CB alters our emotional display, as well as our empathy, our ability to understand someone else's emotions. So both the giving and the receiving of emotions are changed by 2CB. 5 years later, the same team, they did a follow-up study right here, or I guess 3 years later. They did a follow-up study, slightly larger. They had 26 participants. Again, everyone had to have used 2CB at some point in the past before being in the study, so they were not drug naive. And they gave people, people used on their own 3 different doses, 10, 15, or 20 milligrams. They found, honestly, this was some pretty basic, this is like some real basic research. So it transiently increases blood pressure and heart rate, as you would expect. And then when you're sober 6 hours later, your blood pressure and heart rate are back to normal. It increases subjective effects. So there's all sorts of scales out there, like the hallucinogen rating scale and the ARCI, and the addiction, what's the ARCI? Addiction Research Clinical Inventory, I think, whatever that one is, and some visual scales of just drug effects, and pretty much everything went up when you took a drug, which is not surprising to me. I could tell you all of the things that went up, but honestly, it would be quicker and more interesting to me to tell you the things that didn't change. So people, even on the high dose of 20 milligrams of 2CB, people did not report a subjective rating of bad effects, or dizziness, or fear, or sadness. People did report hallucinating. They hallucinated colors or lights. They did not hallucinate animals, things, insects, or people. And they did not hallucinate sounds or voices. So some mild hallucinations, but nothing complex. And that's it. that's it for the human research of observing people in a laboratory setting taking 2CB, 3 studies in a 43-year period. So you in the audience, you are now as much of an expert as any other scientist as far as what 2CB does to people. There's only 3 of them. I did find one more, which is pretty interesting. It's a little bit different though. So this just came out last year. This is from a group in New York, and they this was a qualitative interview. So they said to people, hey, you've used 2CB in the past. How did that go? And then they just kind of recorded the conversations and found some common themes. So the overall study had 39 people. 17 of those people had used 2CB. So they interviewed these 17 people. What was it like when you used 2CB? And they just collated some themes and described a few commonalities that most or all people reported. And here are a few pull quotes that I grabbed. It seemed pretty common that people who had used 2CB said it's kind of light. You can kind of still be a little functional. One participant described it as the Diet Coke of psychedelics. That makes me never want to try 2CB, but I think they meant that in a good way. I'm not really sure. Another person described it as a beginner psychedelic. So it's kind of light, it's easy to handle, it's a Diet Coke, it's not like a hard, difficult experience. Dose is very important. Just a few milligrams difference in your dose can greatly affect your high. And we're talking about like 15 or 20 milligrams. So I don't know about you, but I don't have a scale that's accurate enough to measure the difference between 19 milligrams and 20 milligrams. You can certainly get a scale, but your average kitchen or postal scale isn't going to do it. And that is apparently very important that you have a precise dose. Visuals, again, just like the lab research, they're there, but they're not very strong. It's also dose dependent. It's commonly referred to as an entactogen, which means to feel, to generate feelings within. You can feel more in touch with your emotions. There's a pretty pleasurable body high. It can be euphoric or erotic. So a little bit about the subjective experience, but we'll talk more about that later. I just wanted to point this study out. It just came out a few months ago, and it's not a lab study. They weren't like giving people 2CB and asking them about how they felt about Diet Coke. This was just what people reported after the fact. And again, because we have unknown potency or purity, the people in the study might not even have been taking 2CB. They don't know unless they were using reagent kits, which the study didn't talk about. So that's a little bit about what it does subjectively, what it does to your psychology. What's it do in the brain? I'm not a pharmacologist. I used to work in a pharmacology lab, but this too, it's a different language that I'm used to speaking. But it looks like, and there also has been very little human research on this. So just about everything in this slide is based on in vitro or rodent models. And there are many reasons why rodent models are not applicable to humans, especially when we're talking about medicines that primarily influence consciousness, because a mouse consciousness and a human consciousness, I assume, are quite different. I have no way to prove that, but that's my assumption. So this slide is mostly lab or like cell line or rodent research, so take it all with a few grains of salt, but it looks like 2CB primarily is a 5-HT2C partial agonist. That seems to be the main mechanism, which is fascinating to me. Maybe it is a weak partial agonist for 5-HT2A, or maybe it doesn't have any interactions at all. I've seen both claims in recent articles. This is interesting because your classic psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, DMT, even MDMA, they are 5-HT2A agonists, and that is hypothesized to be what makes a psychedelic psychedelic. If it's the reason that you get hallucinations and visions and out-of-body experiences and all of that stuff is because the chemical is a 5-HT2A agonist, and 2C-B is not that. My claim to fame, as mentioned earlier, is salvinorin A. Salvinorin also has no affinity at all to 5-HT2A or any of the 5-HT subtypes. So 2C-B also not a 2A agonist. So you might call that an atypical psychedelic, or maybe you would just say 2C-B isn't a psychedelic at all. It's an empathogen or an impactogen or something like that. It looks like it inhibits dopamine transport, norepinephrine transport, and serotonin transport in the brain. So it increases the levels of all three of those. Probably it's metabolized by MAO. And it has a 1-hour half-life, which is incredibly short. I've never seen that before. This really, this gets metabolized and just like, peed out of your body very, very quickly. It's metabolized by MAO. So some of you out there, I just want to stop this before you think too much about it. You might think to yourself, well, hey, I could take an MAO inhibitor like harmine, right? That's one of the ingredients in ayahuasca. DMT is famously metabolized by MAO, and that's why it's not orally active. You could just eat handfuls of pure DMT and it's not going to do anything because the MAO breaks it down very quickly, which is why you need to take an MAO inhibitor to make DMT orally active. So 2C-B is also metabolized by MAO. So you might be thinking to yourself, if I eat some harmine first, then I don't have to take as much 2C-B. It'll become more potent, or maybe it'll last longer. Instead of 6 hours, maybe I could make it last 12 hours. But no, don't do that. It's a bad idea. What that will do instead is create or may potentially create a toxic buildup of both the 2C-B as well as metabolic byproducts. And that can lead to serotonin syndrome, seizures, death, all sorts of bad stuff. So do not combine 2C-B with MAO inhibitors. I found this graphic. This is pretty cool. I found this in a paper. If you've never seen a diagram like this before, this is the synaptic cleft in your brain. There's 2 neurons. There's an electrical signal going from the top to the bottom. The electrical signal goes to the end of the neuron, and that's where we create serotonin, shown here as a bunch of purple dots. So we create serotonin and we store them in a vesicle, which is like a little bubble filled with serotonin dots. And then that vesicle travels to the edge of the neuron where the serotonin is released. And then the serotonin is picked up by the bottom receptor, which creates another electrical impulse. And so the message continues from one neuron to another. This is the basic theory of how gray matter works. 2C-B might alter this in at least 3 ways. So MAO, I was just talking about MAO. It is depicted here as a nice little orange Pac-Man shape. MAO kind of goes around and it eats up serotonin so it doesn't stick around for too long. And 2C-B inhibits MAO so that the serotonin and the 2C-B can stick around longer. 2C-B also inhibits the reuptake of serotonin. So the vesicle releases serotonin into the synapse, and then a reuptake transporter vacuums it back up where it came from. You might have heard of Prozac, PIHKAL, things like that. Those kind of classic antidepressants, those are SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. 2C-B is a serotonin reuptake inhibitor at high doses. So the serotonin is not eaten up by the MAO Pac-Man. It is not vacuumed back up by the reuptake transporter. And then also, again, at high doses, probably higher than most people are going to be using recreationally or street use or whatever. I don't like the term recreational. It has a lot of baggage. But anyway, so also at high doses, 2C-B will directly agonize the serotonin receptor on the bottom receptor. 2C-B will just sort of make that bottom receptor or that bottom synapse fire with that electrical thing. So there's on the serotonin receptor. So there's 3 different ways that 2C-B alters how serotonin works in your brain. And all 3 of these can lead, when all 3 of these are happening together, it can lead to too much serotonin. You can have too much of a good thing, and that can lead to the aforementioned serotonin syndrome, which can be very dangerous. So certainly taking 2C-B with an SSRI, like Prozac, is a bad idea. I would say SNRIs, just pretty much any of the newer antidepressants is probably a bad idea. I would not do that. And here's a nice little graphic as to why that is. So a little bit about, and that's it for my slides. So in summary, I just wanted to share with everyone a little bit about what 2C-B is, where it came from, who we can thank for its invention, and now you know just as much about the human subject research as I do and as anyone else, because there's so little of it. I did find a few reports of side effects, negative, like adverse reactions, people going to emergency departments after taking too much 2C-B, things like that. It's really hard to make sense of those because you don't know if what they took is actually 2C-B, because unknown potency and purity due to terrible non-scientific prohibition laws. And also you don't know much about the person. You know, did they have a personal or a family history of psychosis? Were they going through something? Did they have significant unresolved childhood trauma? Were they taking other drugs at the same time? Like, there's just so many unknowns, but there are reports people go to are reported to poison control centers or emergency departments. Most of this literature is out of Europe, and they report things like agitation, aggression, what else? Tachycardia. So there's some cardiac symptoms, confusion, hallucinations. Less commonly, but more scary effects include things like amnesia and syncope. And I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, but rhabdomyolysis, which, whoa, that I'm a doctor, but I'm not a medical doctor. My very basic understanding of rhabdomyolysis is your body starts to eat its own muscles. This sounds terrible. And that has been reported to happen in conjunction with 2C-B. But again, we don't really know all the details, like how common is that? Was that a bad batch? Did they take something else entirely, but it was just sold as 2C-B? We don't know about other kinds of conditions. So there's some scary kind of ER reports, but it's very small numbers, and it's inconclusive. So that's me telling you all the scary risks and the bad stuff about 2C-B and a little bit about what's going on in the brain. And now I will turn it over to my colleagues to tell you more about what it's actually like.
Peter, thank you so much. That was a great presentation, really detailed. At this point, I'd like to introduce Rhea and Niko. They will present their findings on 2C-B, after which we'll take questions with the time remaining. Rhea Morais is a therapist specializing in shame, trauma, and psychedelic integration work. She has worked in the field of mental health for the past 8 years with various populations, including adults with schizophrenia and spectrum disorders. She also works with adolescents in the juvenile justice system. Niko McGee is a trauma-focused therapist that offers EMDR, psychedelic integration, and specializes in addiction. He has experience in cross-cultural psychology research in the South Pacific and supervising clinicians who answer the Veterans Crisis Line and Oregon Youth Line. Niko and Rhea are both pursuing their masters in professional mental health counseling at Lewis and Clark College. Dr. Addy, Nia, and Rico currently practice psychotherapy together at a clinic in Vancouver. Welcome, Rhea and Niko.
Thanks, Donna. Yeah, thank you, Peter. We are the end friends of the Dr. Addy and Friends. We have some qualitative research for you. We conducted a few interviews of folks who have done 2C-B and about their experience. And we have some great quotes for you. Oops. There we go. All right, Rhea, you can take it away.
Yeah, so because there was not much research, as Dr. Addy said, about 2C-B, we thought that it would be interesting if we could kind of just conduct our own informal qualitative research. So we interviewed 8 people, and it was semi-structured qualitative interviews. We had, a small amount of questions that we thought of beforehand to ask. And then the rest was kind of just open to whatever our participants wanted to share with us that they thought would be relevant from their experiences. So yeah, and we recruited people from Twitter and Reddit, and then just also word of mouth. And so let's see. So the questions that we asked were just about the set and setting, what was the setting that they're in, were they at home, were they with people, how was their mindset beforehand, and then just generally how they would describe their experience with 2C-B. And that included questions about their sensory experience, things that they heard, saw, etc. We asked about dosage, and then we asked about whether or not they took it with other substances. And it was pretty common for a lot of the participants to have taken it in conjunction with other things. But a few people had taken it just by itself. And then we had a question about integration. Were there takeaway messages afterwards? Anything therapeutic or valuable that they found from the experience, and anything that they carried with them afterwards. So let's see. So for my participants, because Niko and I kind of just divided it up between us. So for the first participant, they had several different experiences. There was the county fair at one of their experiences. They're anxious but excited beforehand. The second and third times were with their partner at home, and that was kind of a loving and connected headspace. And then another participant had multiple experiences and kind of went into the experiences in an experimental mindset. So kind of just doing it out of curiosity. And he had done it alone. He had done it at raves, parties, music festivals, Burning Man. He had multiple different experiences to draw from. And so that was sometimes in conjunction with other substances and sometimes by itself. A third participant also had multiple experiences. They described being in kind of a fun headspace, some anxiety at the start. And that participant was particularly drawn to having those experiences in nature. He described enjoying it at the beach, sometimes hiking or at parks. He often did it either with his family and spouse present or alone. And he also described some experiences with colleagues, a weekend with friends. And then another participant had multiple experiences also, and had said that they made sure that they were in a good headspace beforehand. And then they had done it with friends at an apartment and then also out in the field with a friend.
All right, and on to my participants. The first one I interviewed, she's had one experience with 2C-B, and this was at Burning Man in the wee hours of one of the last nights. She described it as being alone for the first part of it, and then was able to reconnect with a long-lost lover towards the end. She called this Burning Man moving man because she had all of her life belongings in her car. She was moving from the Bay Area over to the Southwest. Second interviewee had several experiences, couldn't really count how many times he's done it. A lot of which were done on his college campus. And another kind of a popular experience was camping birthday celebrations. Next participant, also several experiences, maybe 6 to 9 times they estimated. Again, festivals was kind of a big kind of focal point for this, and also college campus, usually always done in a social setting. And the last participant, multiple occasions, I think in the ballpark of 20 times or so. Again, college campus, and one-on-one with the intimate partner. So the next part, yeah, so we kind of just asked generally, how would you describe your experience in 2C-B, maybe to somebody who's never done it before? Kind of a lot of positive quotes for this. One of my favorites tends to be a very positive experience, upbeat, kind of this vividness that Dr. Addy talked about, colorful, playful, energizing. Somebody put it as more rolly than LSD and more psychedelic than MDMA, so somewhere in the middle. As somebody else described it as a peak life experience, one of the best days of my life.
Yeah, and then some other quotes were that someone described it as a weird body load, feeling like he was going to explode out of his body. So really, really intense somatic experience. Someone else, actually a few participants described it as having kind of a childlike awe quality to it. And then someone said that there was like the loving feelings, empathic feelings that you get from MDMA. Someone described it as the most gentle and reliable psychedelic that they've used. Someone else said feelings of euphoria, just a little bit euphoric or at peace with my situation and talkative. And then someone else said everything was more interesting and affects me in a ticklish way. That was the word that was very specific to that feeling. It's an amusement for a particular kind of adventure. And then someone else said it was fine. It never really clicked for that person. So a lot of different experiences.
All right, on the sensory stuff. So we kind of asked the gamut of the 5 senses and if they could kind of recall different things related to 2C-B. And these are kind of the highlights that we picked from. So some of the visuals, this breathing, curling, unfurling, particularly living things, lovely Van Gogh style distortions and waves. And then again, this light tracings, intense colors, vividness, seeing faces and things. Touch, it offered a nice pillowy softness. I really liked that one. Probably the most fun I had was dancing with another person. Yeah, so this participant spoke to movement and how kind of pleasant dancing and movement was when they were on 2C-B. Very heightened tactile awareness and very sensual. Some people spoke to kind of the sexual nature of it and the intimacy part and how it kind of enhanced that. Others said no, it didn't. I don't really remember any kind of enhanced sexual experiences. Music sounded nice. It was definitely enhanced. And then smell. Not many people recalled smells. But that was one of my favorites there, the smell of lover's hair.
So dosage, duration, and ingestion. The average dose was kind of 15 to 20 milligrams on the low side. 20 milligrams to 25 milligrams was the most common. And then someone had done 40 milligrams on the higher end of that. And then duration was about 4 to 6 hours, generally short-lived. And with the last at least hour or so as kind of the come down. And then just as far as ingestion goes, oral was the most common. It's in generally pill or pressed tablet form. And some people did report snorting it, and that was generally reported as not a good idea and very painful.
Then one other note about ingestion. Somebody kind of noted that they were trying to recall if they did suppository of it, and then they said, I lose track of things that I put in my butt. Yeah, so there's that. Is this one my slide, Rhea, or your slide?
Go for it.
Yeah, okay. So this kind of idea of taking it in combination with other psychedelics, we're pretty split here amongst the interviewees. One person said, I don't see any need to take it with anything else. They were a really big fan of it on its own. I think they described it as one of their favorite psychedelics of all time. And again, and then, the complete opposite end of the spectrum, I rarely took it in isolation. So, others were fans of how it can potentiate other drugs that they've tried. One of the participants says they almost always took it with LSD, and they would take it either kind of in the middle of their LSD experience or towards the tail end of it. And similar to this MDMA, we pulled this quote from PIHKAL, and the Shulgins kind of described it pretty well in this. But many of the reports that have come in over the years have mentioned the combination of MDMA and 2C-B. The most successful reports have followed a program in which the two drugs are not used at the same time, nor even too closely spaced. It appears that the optimum time for the 2C-B is at or just before the final baseline recovery of MDMA. And some of the participants kind of talked how it was kind of a gentle come down. One of my first participants I talked to said they took MDMA kind of throughout the day, and then they took 2C-B as they were on their final come down and said it was a nice, smooth come down. And then other drugs mentioned too were cannabis and alcohol. Anything to add with this slide, Rhea?
No, I think you covered it.
Cool.
And then just as far as adverse effects went, several people reported having some GI discomfort and just kind of a lot of bodily discomfort in general. Someone else said that he would worry about his blood pressure rising, his heart rate would increase, and he would have to do kind of some breathing exercises or yoga to relax. Someone described snorting as being like a hot expanding knife up my nose. So some issues with that method of intake. And then let's see, another participant had a friend who had just kind of licked the powder form of it and was not able to, be aware of how much he took. And then he ended up having a lot of kind of paranoia and delusions during that experience, which he was able to integrate afterwards. It seemed like that wasn't like a lasting psychosis, but just during the trip was having a lot of delusions and paranoia. And then multiple participants just reported like having overwhelming bodily sensations, anxiety, physical discomfort, and to the point that it was kind of overwhelming at times.
One of the wrap-up questions we had for everyone was, does it have therapeutic potential and why? A lot of folks, right, just kind of reflexively said yes, definitely, and then kind of followed up with different explanations. So the first one said, anytime we enter a space intentionally, it can be therapeutic. So it wasn't necessarily something specific about the 2C-B journey, but the fact that it does alter your state of mind and kind of enhances things, it can be therapeutic. in their eyes. And the next person, yes, I tend to think of it more of a cerebral thing and allows you to work more through cerebral things. And this was kind of a theme amongst two of my participants of this kind of idea of controllability. You're able to kind of be more cognitive, kind of this Diet Coke or, Diet Pepsi idea of the psychedelic, where it's, relatively gentle. And so the fact that you can kind of maybe work through some things in your head through it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then among the participants that I interviewed, one said that it was nourishing to their soul and felt that it was therapeutic in that way. And then my other participants actually said that it was not therapeutic. One had said that it was to an extent, but that other psychedelics such as LSD or psilocybin were actually more useful to him for introspective or therapeutic uses. And then the last person had said that he didn't really get anything therapeutic necessarily, but that he takes it often for fun, and in a sense that is valuable to him still. So it's not strictly therapeutic, but he's still finding a lot of benefit from it in his life.
All right, and lastly, we just kind of would wrap up with, did you take away anything? Do you kind of integrate anything to your daily life from these 2C-B journeys? Kind of the overwhelming consensus on my end was people couldn't exactly recall something specific about the 2C-B journey itself. And it was kind of washed out or kind of mixed up with other psychedelic experiences, or maybe with the other combination of drugs that they took throughout that night or throughout their history. Yeah.
Yeah, so one quote was, "I felt more at peace with myself and the world after it. I'm a more relaxed person with less fear or stress after my experiences with the drug." Someone else described experiencing sacred hedonism, which was kind of described as pleasure as being a spiritual experience. Someone else had said that he actually reflected a lot about gender while on it, and he had at a high dose had not been able to tell if he was male or female or a different gender, and had also reflected on kind of his work habits, where he was going in life, what the future would hold for him, what the experience meant to him, that kind of thing. And then, yeah, do you want to finish up?
Yeah, and that's the end of our presentation.
Cool. Thanks, Rhea and Niko. How many people did you interview total?
8 total.
Okay, right on.